Welcome back to the show, week 13, continuing the as yet still unnamed show. You see the little joke up there? Yeah, because I'm just still not ready to commit. But as you can tell from what you're seeing here, I do have some new graphics and everything, trying to add a bit of, I guess, gravitas visually, if not in terms of the commentary. But anyway, yeah, so let's see. Let's run a little contest, see if you can figure out where the inspiration for the graphic style came from. But lots of big news. We're going to be going all over the world, as we so often do. And again, as we so often do, we're going to be starting off with Edward Snowden. Earlier this week, Attorney General Eric Holder announced to the world, and more specifically perhaps to the Russian government, that if they do extradite Edward Snowden, the U.S. will not seek to employ the death penalty against the leaker who told the world and the American public about the wiretapping and data mining and various other civil liberties violations of the NSA. Now, that's good news, all else being equal, although we're going to break it down a little bit here. And so here's specifically what Eric Holder said. The criminal charges Snowden faces do not carry the death penalty, and that the U.S. will not seek the death penalty even if Snowden were charged with additional death penalty eligible crimes. And so I'm glad objectively both for the first part of that sentence and also especially for the second one, because it's all well and good to say that the current crimes don't carry the death penalty. If you then, once you have the hacker in your hands, you then apply more penalties that could lead to the death penalty. So it's a good thing that they're saying that they're not going to do that. Now I'm just going to give my theory on why they're doing this. It seems like the United States and Eric Holder in particular are getting a little bit desperate. You know, early on in the first week or two after this information came out and we identified who the leaker was, they had this strength in what they were saying, and now it's, well, we're not going to kill you. Next week, maybe we'll slap you around a little bit, and then finally, we're going to give you a Netflix subscription. So they're weakening their rhetoric a little bit, and they're doing that for one of two reasons. One is to convince the Russian government not to worry, because I'm sure the main thing that Vladimir Putin has been worried about is Edward Snowden being killed. That doesn't really seem real. Perhaps more realistically, it's lowering the bar of the consequences that Edward Snowden himself could face if he chose to come to the United States. But I have a feeling that they got to lower the bar a whole lot lower than that. And the main reason for that is, and I'm sure many of you were thinking this as you initially heard the information from Eric Holder, simply not killing him does not mean that he's going to have an easy time of it if he comes back stateside. After all, Bradley Manning, still alive, not a very good time to be Bradley Manning, though. The being left in a cell by yourself for extremely long periods of time, the beatings, the humiliation, the various other consequences that Bradley Manning has faced. Edward Snowden doesn't want to face those even if he's left alive. So, like I said, all else being equal, it's good that the United States is coming out and making very clear, hopefully without later backtracking, that they will not kill Edward Snowden for leaking the information. But that's 1/10 of the way to what we would see, I think, at least on my side, as a just conclusion to this entire affair. Okay, moving on. So the little graphic move. The American public is against the war in Afghanistan, but it took them a little while to get there. Unfortunately, it's 12 years almost into our war in Afghanistan, and now finally the numbers are peaking even more against it. And so I'm referring to an ABC News Washington Post poll. It shows when you break down, was it worth going into Afghanistan in the first place? 28% say that it was worth going in, so that's a very low number. 67% say it's not worth it. 43% say that it has contributed to the country's long-term security. What's also interesting is that a significant chunk of it has contributed to the country's long-term security apparently still believe that it wasn't worth going in. And I think that that's reasonable. You can certainly think that it could help out, but that it wasn't worth it overall, especially when you factor in the sheer amount of money. After all, that money could have been spent in other ways to ensure our security without costing us so much in terms of how the world views us, how people in Afghanistan view us, and also the lives of all the soldiers and civilians who've died in that conflict. Now, moving on to what the American public thinks about what we should do in the future in regards to Afghanistan, if you ask them what should our involvement be post-2014, so a little bit over a year in the future, 53% favor keeping a residual force, although that's not defined very specifically, so there's the possibility that people are reading into that what they want. 43% say that U.S. forces should leave altogether. Now, of course, I wish that number was much higher because I see extremely little potential gain in the future in Afghanistan, but that is a big chunk of the United States. And even the 53% that say we should have a residual force, who knows what they imagine that to actually be? 1,000 troops, 10,000 troops, certainly lower than the current amount that we have. And when you put that together, the 53 and the 43, that doesn't leave a whole lot of people in America who think that we should send 100,000 troops in Afghanistan. So, like I said, it's almost 12 years into the conflict. I wish that Americans had held these positions after a year or two, but this is certainly progress. And what I hope is that people who are approaching the questions now in regard to Afghanistan and say that it wasn't worth it, hopefully they'll take that information and apply that the next time warmongering is going on, because it won't be more than a couple more years, I would imagine, before a politician comes before the American public and says, Iran is a threat, Syria is a threat, whatever country, you can insert whichever country you want, and says we should go in. And I hope that the American public thinks back to our experience over more than a decade in Afghanistan and realizes maybe we should think twice before starting another war. Actually, somewhat related to this, because it does have to do with American foreign policy, and particularly how we have pursued the war on terror. We have a bit of a catfight going on between Chris Christie and Rand Paul, two of who we have to imagine Republicans who will be running for the presidency the next time around. And already the blows are starting to be traded back and forth, which is both exciting for me as someone who's interested in politics, but also the actual conflict that they have here is actually quite interesting. So Chris Christie is attacking Rand Paul, but libertarians more specifically over their foreign policy. We've got two clips we're going to play for you. Here's the first.
I just want us to be really cautious, because this strain of libertarianism that's going through both parties right now and making big headlines, I think is a very dangerous thought. President Obama has done nothing to change the policies of the Bush administration in the war on terrorism, and I mean practically nothing. And you know why? Because they work.
A couple of interesting things from that first clip. The first is that he used the word strain of libertarianism. That's pretty interesting. First, he tries to say that it's in the Democrats as well, and I don't think that that's a strong part of at least the elected Democrats. But specifically considering that in certain areas of the Republican base, especially the younger Republicans, libertarianism is not exactly a small portion, and particularly the sorts of people who engage in primary battles and who vote in primaries probably have a good chance of being libertarians. And so it's an interesting move to take to down on that. But also, like I said, specifically using the word strain, which when you think about that, the first thing you think of is probably disease. That's a questionable road to go down. It might pay off for him, but considering the nature of the Republican Party in 2013, I kind of doubt it. And also saying that we don't have to change the way that we pursue the war on terror because Obama hasn't changed it, implying that the only reason that could possibly be true is that it's working. No, that's not the only reason that we could have not changed it. One is that, unfortunately, far too many people who were advising the Bush administration are still advising the Obama administration and possibly giving them the same horrible advice. Now, granted, we haven't had a 9/11 level terrorist attack against the United States, and so to that extent, I guess it's working. But you can hardly look across the world and think, oh, there's no terrorism, things are going well. So I think that Chris Christie is off base there. But moving on, somebody brings up Rand Paul specifically, and this is what he has to say.
I love all these esoteric debates that people are getting in.
Senator Rand Paul, for example?
Well, listen, you can name any number of people who've engaged in it, and he's one of them. I mean, these esoteric intellectual debates, I want them to come to New Jersey and sit across from the widows and the orphans and have that conversation. And they won't, because that's a much tougher conversation to have.
So that's where it gets into catfight territory. Now, look, the nominating process for the Republicans is going to start ramping up over the next 12 months, 18 months, at the very latest. That's what modern elections are like. And so we understand that they're going to start trading blows. I wonder specifically why he decided to do it in this case. Because, look, Chris Christie is not, Louis Gohmert. He's not Steve King. He's not a complete moron. If he brought it up, trust me, he intended to bring it up. And it's possible that maybe it's not the worst idea. Now, look, attacking libertarianism when you were a Republican in 2013, maybe not the best idea. But I do think that a lot of Americans have a problem with the way that, we've managed our foreign policy. I don't know that they specifically have a massive problem with what Rand Paul thus far has said, and that's why it seems like he's probably not going to score that many points. But it does open up an interesting conversation between Rand Paul and Chris Christie about how we should pursue the war on terror, specifically how we should use drones and things like that. And so expect to see more of that in the future. And considering that most Americans, not just Republicans, have a problem with the way that we've used drones, and more should, I'm glad that we're going to have that conversation. But Rand Paul does strike back, or specifically a staffer, a representative for Rand Paul does strike back, and this is what he said. This is Paul's senior advisor, Doug Stafford. If Governor Christie believes the constitutional rights and the privacy of all Americans is esoteric, he either needs a new dictionary or he needs to talk to more Americans, because a great number of them are concerned about the dramatic overreach of our government in recent years. Defending America and fighting terrorism is the concern of all Americans, especially Senator Paul. But it can and must be done in keeping with our Constitution and while protecting the freedoms that make America exceptional. Now, if you just take that statement at face value, I'm inclined to agree with him for the most part, except for it's when you get into the actual defining the words that he used there that I might, and I imagine you might have a problem with it. The dramatic overreach of our government. The government has overreached in a variety of ways. The things that he would consider an overreach probably different than what I would. And also must be done in keeping with our Constitution, fighting terrorism and stuff like that. Now, look, from time to time, Rand Paul, very good on the issue of drones. He initially did his filibuster. The Young Turks was totally in favor at that time, and so that's fine. But then you started asking him more questions about it, and even domestic use of drones, he actually had much more tolerance for it than it seemed at first. And so I don't know at this point how this is going to shake out. I imagine both Rand Paul and Chris Christie are going to be front runners for the Republican nomination. And I like that they're not just talking about gays and Christians and guns. Like, these are substantive issues that need to be debated, not just among the Democrats, but with Republicans as well. I don't know which of them is going to win out on this issue, but I hope that reporters will at the very least ask him more questions specifically about the use of drones, extrajudicial killings of American citizens abroad, and things like that, because those are important issues going forward. More important issues. Got to do something about that little... Not a big fan of that. Anyway. Okay. The extremism and short-sightedness and stupidity of the House knows no bounds. Their next move that they just took was slashing the EPA budgets for the next year by 34%. $2.8 billion less they believe should be allocated to the EPA. We're going to talk about some specific things that they're trying to roll back, but that's double the 17% that they tried to cut last year that they proposed. So another year or two, we might not even have an EPA anymore, and I'm sure many House Republicans would absolutely love that, but that would be a freaking disaster, and that's the reason we're talking about it here. So as I said, they're going to slash the EPA's 2014 budget by 34%, and there are some specific rules that they're trying to block, and they're trying to defund any EPA ability to regulate in these areas. So here are some of them. To limit carbon emissions from power plants, and let's just stop there for a second. I understand that the Republicans, both for monetary reasons, because of the donations that they get from the coal industry, from the oil industry and things like that, but also because of their just general anti-science stance. They don't believe in global climate change and things of that sort. But trying to stop them from limiting it in any way, even if you don't believe in global warming, is the epitome of short-sightedness and stupidity. Pollution is a problem too. That's killing Americans. I understand that it doesn't shout verses from the Quran and run into a market and explode while killing them, but it does kill Americans. We need to stop these sorts of things. So I think that climate change, the desire to fight climate change should be more than enough when talking about these things. But even if you don't believe in that, pollution and the negative health consequences of that should be more than enough. But again, like I said, short-sighted. More rules that they want to stop the EPA from enforcing that require refiners to sharply cut the sulfur content of gasoline. Again, possible pollution and things like that they're trying to deal with. And as you can expect, the energy companies are fighting back, saying that it would add costs. I'm sure that it would add costs. The problem is the sulfur does add costs as well. Once it gets out into the air, once it gets out into the environment, and exacts its toll on humanity. More rules. They want to stop the Interior Department from completing rules that toughen environmental restrictions on the dumping of waste from mountaintop removal coal mining projects in Appalachian states. And look, hopefully you've seen at least a little bit of coverage of that in the last couple of years. If you want to see more, Think Progress is one of the best sites for that. That's not where this information is coming from, but they cover it quite often. That, again, is a disaster. And look, it's not taking place in San Francisco or New York City or something like that. Like you would think this nexus of Republican and conservatism, they'd want to protect them. But not so much because there's a lot of money in it for them. And so, look, this is just the House. It hasn't passed in the Senate as well. It obviously hasn't been signed by the president. I assume that it will not. But this is why it's so important that in advance of the next election, the midterm elections that are coming up next year, you get engaged and you talk to people about the consequences of allowing the Republicans to continue their hold of the House, let alone taking over the Senate. Little things like cutting the EPA by 34%, I understand that that does not drive people's political behavior very often, but we're talking about your health. We're talking about the health of your eventual children. People will die if we do not regulate these pollutants, like carbon emissions, like sulfur, and things of that sort. The EPA is extremely important, and it needs that money. $2.8 billion, that's nothing compared to the subsidies that we give every single year to the oil manufacturers, to the people drilling for oil and things of that sort. And it's certainly going to pay off way more for Americans. And so it's a shame, it's a travesty that the House Republicans are trying to cut the EPA's budget by this draconian amount. But look, when you look into their budgetary priorities, you understand that a lot of this money would then be put back into the military. It gives you an idea of where they're coming from. Okay, moving on. Jesus, we're burning through today. If you've been paying attention to the news lately, you have certainly seen a lot of train crashes, a lot of plane crashes, and things of that sort, and it can be very scary if you're the sort of person that takes those modes of transportation. You should be scared. It's a scary thing. But I worry, and thankfully Media Matters is covering that a lot of scientists who study this sort of thing are worried about the potential long-term policy consequences of focusing so much on these disasters. And so specifically, recently we had the train crash in Spain, and look, Fox News, and in this case I'm not even just trying to label Fox News as being wrong. It's not just Fox. They say, despite Spain crash, this is their headline, California proceeding with high-speed rail system. And like I said, it's not just Fox News. You can't just say that because Spain had a train crash, we need to worry about, every high-speed rail system in the world. And, they're all suspect, because they're not all suspect, and they're not all operating in the same fashion as the particular train that crashed in Spain. Specifically, Japan and France, they've been operating high-speed rail systems like this for over 3 decades, and they haven't recorded a single fatality yet. We're going to get to comparisons to other modes of transportation, but bear that in mind. Now, Art Guzzetti, he's the Vice President of Policy at the American Public Transportation Association, is also worried about Americans drawing the wrong conclusions from the coverage of things like the Spain train crash or the crash in Canada just a couple of weeks ago. He says, the way the media should cover it is they should look at the whole body of experience, as you can't draw conclusions from one tragic event. The whole body of experience, the whole body of evidence, the whole body of facts shows that passenger rail is safe. The real safety issue is motor vehicles, and he noted that deaths per passenger mile for motor vehicles are over 40 times larger than Amtrak and over 20 times larger than for commuter rail. Now, we've got this little chart we're going to put up. Take a look at this. I understand that the headlines do not reflect this reality, but there are very good reasons for that we're going to cover. So you see here that motor vehicles fatalities per 100 million passenger miles, this is from 2003 to 2008, motor vehicles 1.4 fatalities per 100 million passenger miles. Objectively low by itself, but man, when you look at things like commuter rail and specifically Amtrak, they're much larger, that you barely see it on the chart there. And so why is it that we focus so much more on something like the Spain train crash when across America, way more people died in automobile accidents? Some of the reasons for this is coming from the president of the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety. This is from the New York Times back in 2010, said that it's because motor vehicle fatalities happen in small numbers, are geographically dispersed, and aren't considered headline-grabbing news. And that's a great point. Not to say that they don't cover when cars crash, but it doesn't have the exciting footage of the Spain train crashing, because we had this awesome view of it and everything. We once again are bumping up against limitations in the human brain, the evolution of the human brain. when small little things add up over time, like people dying from pollution, people dying from car accidents, we don't see that as a threat in the way that we do when 100 people die in one event. And that's not because the one event is more dangerous. It's just because that's how our brain has evolved. And so you need to be especially vigilant when seeing news like this to not overestimate the prevalence of it. These crashes, like in Spain, do not happen every week. They don't happen every year even. As I said, Japan and France have been operating for 30 years. And so don't allow it to sway you against public transportation. And as we start to debate over the next month the Hyperloop, bear in mind this public transportation is comparatively very safe. And so very interesting information coming from Media Matters. I'm glad that they're focusing on this. What happened in Spain is a tragedy, but don't let it turn you totally against public transportation and high-speed rail. Somebody, however, that you should be turned against. Ken Cuccinelli is known across the country now because of his anti-sodomy, anti-oral sex views. Now, he's been justifiably mocked across the country because of these views, but don't think that just because he's against sodomy and blowjobs and things like that, that he's some sort of comic figure. No, he's actually a pretty bad guy when you look into some of the things that he's said. So here is a radio interview that Ken Cuccinelli engaged in back in 2012. It was on the conservative radio show The Morning Majority. I have a feeling whatever views are espoused on there are not the majority views, but anyway, he was talking about DC's pest control policies. Now, he's actually wrong on the substance here, but I'm not so much worried about the substance as the rhetoric. Listen to what he says. They have to relocate the rats. And not only that, that's actually not the worst part. They cannot break up the families of the rats. So anyway, it is worse than our immigration policy. You can't break up rat families, or raccoons, and all the rest. And you can't even kill them. It's unbelievable. Now, to play devil's advocate, perhaps what he's saying there, as horrendous as it is only that, thankfully, with our immigration policy, we can break up the families. And so maybe the most offensive thing that he's saying there is just that he thinks it's fine to take immigrant families, break them up, and send some back down to Latin America, South America, wherever they came from, and leave some in America. That's devil's advocate. It's just that horrendous. More likely, it's revealing what he actually thinks about immigrant families. The fact that he is mixing them up so casually with killing rats and raccoons and other sorts of pests, that should raise some warning signs for you if you're considering voting for Ken Cuccinelli in the near future. After all, he is going for governor of Virginia. Pretty important state there, especially as it has been in the last couple electoral cycles, somewhat of a swing state from time to time, or at least it could be in the future. So as we continue to debate immigration reform across the country, once again, a very high-profile Republican is revealing what he actually believes about the people that would be affected by these policies. He believes that it's fine to throw them into conversation in the same breath as talking about wiping out families of rats and raccoons. I understand that when you speak for long periods of time, especially on the radio, you can slip up from time to time. I'm sure that I do it as well. But I don't think that it's a mistake here. I think that he is very specifically using this rhetoric to appeal to the conservative audience of the Morning Majority because they like the idea of these immigrant families being treated, being compared to pests, because that's exactly what they see them as. Once again, as I said, the actual policy implications, the monetary implications of immigration reform are not what are driving many of these Republican politicians. At the very least, some of their base, they think, will be riled up by the sort of xenophobia, the demonizing of the actual immigration, of the individuals who would be affected by immigration reform, and you should not support this. This is horrendous. You cannot talk about immigrants and rats in the same sentence and think that you're going to get away with it, at least on this program. Moving on. Gay athletes who are considering traveling to Russia for the Winter Olympics can rest easy. They will not be persecuted or prosecuted under Russia's new anti-gay homosexual propaganda bill. Now, this has not been covered a lot by in the media, so we're going to give you the details of it. The bill that I'm talking about was signed by Putin back in June of this year, and it banned so-called homosexual propaganda. Specifically, Individuals can be fined up to 5,000 rubles, which equates to about $156, for spreading information aimed at minors directed at forming non-traditional sexual setup or creating a distorted understanding that homosexual and heterosexual relations are socially equivalent. Once again, we have to be understanding this is a different country. They may not be as advanced as even America is when it comes to equality for homosexuals. Like, we've got a long way to go, but they are specifically writing into their laws at the equivalent of the federal level across the country that they're not socially equivalent. But let's go on. The fines increased significantly, 200,000 rubles, or about $62.50, for individuals who post the information on the internet or in the media, while organizations can be fined up to 1 million rubles, $31,000, and a shutdown of their activity for 90 days. In addition, foreigners charged under the law can be deported. Now, before we get back to the Olympic angle, think about that. $30,000 and possibly being shut down for 90 days if an organization does any sort of outreach intended to have youths in Russia or others think that it's socially acceptable to be homosexual or to engage in those sorts of relationships, or maybe they should be allowed to marry, or various other things like that. Like, we have problems in America, trust me. And, you know, even the recent Supreme Court cases don't give me a lot of hope necessarily in the next couple of years for marriage equality. But Jesus, Russia is a couple of steps behind us. Now, we've got some polls about how individuals, not just Putin and the legislators, but individuals in Russia view homosexuals. And so here's what we've got. This is an online poll, so take it with a massive grain of salt. 15% of about 900 LGBT people surveyed in Russia said they'd been physically attacked at least once in the previous 10 months. 15% is too high. It's not a very high number. It's too high when you're talking about being physically assaulted for your sexuality. And furthermore, the Levanda Center did a poll in 2013, so just a little bit earlier in April of this year, and also back in 2005. And look, they asked Russians, should gays and lesbians have the same rights as heterosexuals? Back in 2005, 51% said they should. That's a majority. Back in 2005, that's a good number. Unfortunately, in 2013, it has dropped all the way down to 39%, so a significant drop in the last 8 years. Now, why is that? Look, it could be due to economic hardship generally. In times of economic, military hardship, things of that sort, people do become more xenophobic. They become more inclined to discriminate against outgroups. It's easy to want to see them as causing the problems in the country. We've seen that in many historical cases over the past 100, 150 years. And so I can only imagine that that's what it is. But there's been a number of articles lately wondering why it is that Russia has become so homophobic. Now, look, I think it's great that they're saying that the Olympic athletes won't be persecuted, although that remains to be seen because, look, they're not going to be fined, perhaps, for distributing propaganda, but do they have to worry for their safety? At this point, it seems like they should worry for their safety. And look, this is not where we need to be as a world. We have major problems. The problems are not caused by homosexual athletes, so Russia needs to back off in this case. And hopefully, eventually, we'll see a repeal of that homosexual propaganda bill as well. One area of progress in America, however, is when it comes to marijuana, and we will actually be seeing some interesting advertisements in the near future. At an upcoming NASCAR event, you can expect to see a very interesting advertisement for a product you might never have seen a video advertisement for in the past. Let's watch an excerpt.
If you're an adult who enjoys a good beer, there's a similar product you might want to know about. One without all the calories and serious health problems. Less toxic so it doesn't cause hangovers or overdose deaths, and it's not linked to violence or reckless behavior. Marijuana. Less harmful than alcohol, and time to treat it that way. For more information, visit marijuanaissafer.org.
Yeah, that's right. They're going to be running an ad for marijuana. So there's a couple things I want to say about this, but just some of the details. The Marijuana Policy Project is going to be showcasing this as people enter this NASCAR event. And it's a very large event. It's expected that up to 600,000 people might see it as the stadium seats 225,000 people. That doesn't even seem possible, but apparently it's true. Apparently NASCAR is much more popular than I thought it was, at least out in LA. But anyway, the ad is going to appear about 72 different times. It's a 30-second ad. And they got very cheap access, by the way, to these advertisements. They spent about $350 to produce it. and then an additional $2,200 to run the ads. And so you see there, they take an interesting angle on making the case for marijuana. The ad is not just talking about how marijuana is not bad for you. It might even have some health benefits, although the research continues to come in, but specifically attacking alcohol in a quasi-beer-like ad. That's the style of it, although the font is not that admirable, or the work that was put into that could have used a couple more drafts. But I wonder about it, because if there's any audience that likes their beer and likes their whiskey, two sorts of products, by the way, that are also advertising and sponsoring this event, it's a NASCAR audience. And so I worry that the actual benefit of the ad might be lost by attacking something that the people seeing the ad like. Now, I agree, in a lot of ways, marijuana seems to be significantly better for you than consuming large amounts of alcohol, specifically beer. The weight effects, as they talk about, the link to domestic violence, again, I might not have gone in that direction. But it is an interesting angle to take on this, and they're certainly going to get a lot of advertisement. Now, we will come back if there is some fallout from this, which there might well be, but it's an interesting little area that we should expect to see more advertisements for in the future. In the last couple of years, in a couple of states, Colorado and Washington, it's been approved for recreational use. More states are allowing it for medicinal use. And so it's a product, and this is America. The ads are going to come. I wonder if future ads will continue this anti-beer, anti-alcohol angle. But we'll have to wait and find out. One last story before we roll out the end of week 13. We've got more community interaction for you. The weekly roundup is back after a couple-week hiatus. You guys need to tweet me questions if you want me to do these, but I do have some that I want to respond to, and I'm going to be starting with Douglas Richardson. He says, "Thank you for your hard work at TYT, John. Out of most of the reporters on the program, I like you the best, logical and surgical." Now, I'm not just saying this because it's complimentary, although that certainly doesn't hurt, but I like specifically the logical and surgical. I like that. I'd never thought about, how I'm approaching what I do in that way, but that's what I'm going to aim for in the future. I certainly, like most liberals, have a lot of respect for logic and try to employ it as much as possible, but the surgical is a nice angle there too. I recently played the Surgeon Simulator game. I did not do a very good job there. Hopefully I can do a better job on this program. Moving on, Professor Rich in Texas says, "So when are you going to do the Austin-LA compare-contrast for me?" So I can talk a little bit about that now. I've now spent over a year and a half in LA after spending about 5 years in Austin. And look, partially it's because, I spent more time in Austin. I had a very large group of friends there, and I had great experiences there. My heart is still with Austin. LA is perfectly fine, but God, Austin is just such a great city. I mean, feel free to comment down below if you've been there, but it's just great. The people, the food, the music, the outdoor activities, the weather is great. I just loved it, and I hope someday to have the excess money necessary to set up a studio there, and then we can set up TYT Austin. That would be awesome. But LA does have some benefits as well. It's a much larger city. Some people want that. I mean, there's the beach nearby. In Austin, you have to travel like 3 hours, maybe even longer to get towards any sort of beach. Now, granted, in Austin, you do have Lady Bird Lake, so you have some beach, sort of, but it's not the ocean, so let's be fair. Also, Austin has no professional sports teams. You have to travel to Dallas or Houston or San Antonio from an hour and a half again to 3 hours or longer to see professional sports, whereas LA has multiple sports teams in multiple sports. And so there are definitely pros and cons to each. As I said, my heart is still in Austin, but LA is a great city as well. Moving on, Anthony Gonzalez says, "What do you think the chances are that Congress will actually be able to defund the NSA domestic spying?" If you had asked me a month ago, I would have said close to zero. But I do like that both Democrats and Republicans are standing up against it now. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that the Republicans speaking out against it are, for the most part, political opportunists. And if it takes so long that a Republican can get into the presidency, expect their objections to die down real fast. But for now, they are speaking out against it, mainly because they hate Obama. Look, if they're in the right, I don't really care what their reasoning is. And so it is possible. What they need to do is they need to scare Obama. A lot of people, including myself, including Cenk Uygur, believe that the reason that Obama continues these sorts of policies is because he has military advisors coming in and saying, if you don't do this, Americans are going to die, your poll numbers are going to tank, and they're scaring him. So we need to scare him more. We need to tell him in the midterm elections, the next time a Democrat runs for the presidency, they will lose if they continue these policies, if these policies are still in place. And we need to scare him where it comes to the two most important things, money and votes. And that's the only way it's going to happen. And thankfully, this seems like one issue that Republicans and Democrats can attack Obama in a bipartisan manner for. And so maybe we'll see something. I don't know what the exact number chance is. 27% chance that they can get it stopped by defunding it. So we'll see. Last comment for today. This is coming from Gravetti. I am Jazzy Soul. That's interesting. What do you think about President Obama speaking about Trayvon Martin and the racial bias backlash? I did cover this on the program last week, but I don't mind talking about it again. I understand that people's objection to it in part is that it's one particular trial, and it seems weird to have the president talking about that when he is a national figure tasked with dealing with international issues, talking about one case in particular is suspect. And I totally understand that. In this case, though, I don't have a problem with it. Obama has, in the past, given a couple of speeches about race, and I think that they were great speeches. I think that he has the understanding based on his biracial background, the experience he's had growing up in this country that other presidents in the past have not had. And so I appreciate him speaking out. To the extent that he helped to ward off potential rioting or anything like that, I think, again, it's a good thing. Now, do I think the federal government should get involved in the continuation of the case? That I don't know about. Look, if civil rights violations or something like that, maybe. I don't think that Obama should personally be involved in that. If Eric Holder wants to do something, I'm more amenable to that sort of course of action. But I don't have a problem with it. I have a problem with the Republicans who think that every time race is brought up by Obama, he's saying kill Whitey. That was a good headline I saw recently. And I think that it's accurate. I have more of a problem with the reaction to Obama's speech than I do to the speech itself. Anyway, those are the 4 comments I'm going to highlight today. If you have questions you'd like me to answer, of course, you can leave them in the comments down below. You can tweet me at Iadarola. I love hearing from you guys, and I look forward to answering your questions on a future episode of the Weekly Roundup. That is, however, also the end of the program. I understand I did not cover as many stories as I have in past weeks, partly because I was putting together the little graphics and the templates and the blah, blah, blah. It's very time-consuming, as I'm sure you can imagine, and I have to fit it in on the weekends because this is just all in my spare time. I have to work on other stuff like for What the Flick and the main show and TYTU and The Point and all these other programs I'm on. But anyway, thank you for joining me once again for episode 13. I love having this opportunity to speak to you guys about stories that I don't get to cover on TYTU. I look forward to doing it in the future. And as always, I do this for you guys. So if you have topics that you want to see covered, specific news stories, but also I want to hear more about environmental news. I want to hear more about transportation news. I want to hear more about military news. I love hearing that stuff from you guys, so feel free to let me know. And of course, I'll see you next week on episode 14 of the still unnamed program.